Welcome to my fifth lecture in my series on Middle East politics. For today's lecture, we're going to be discussing the Gunpowder Empires. So in order to get started, I'm going to share my screen with all of you. All right, so the Gunpowder Empires represent a very critical turning point in Middle East history. In many ways, they are seen as the period of transition for the Middle East from what's called the traditional to the modern world. This is going to be a transition that comes with a lot of socioeconomic instability, political violence, and a lot of cultural change for the region as it really begins to interact with what we call Western modernity. And so, to understand this era in Islamic history and the impacts it left on the present, first we have to understand the influence of the Turkish invasions on the Islamic world. All of these different gunpowder empires, the Ottoman, the Safavid Empire, as well as in northern India, the Mughal Empire, they were founded by these Turkish invaders that invaded the Middle East and North Africa and the Indian subcontinent during the late Middle Ages. So we're going to understand how this influenced the region. And in the process itself, several important institutions are going to emerge in the Middle East during this era. What we call a sultan or an absolute monarch. We're going to understand how this concept differs from this term caliph, which I discussed in a previous lecture. So make sure to check that out if you have not done so. We're also going to specifically zone in on some of these specific empires. We're going to focus on the Ottoman and Safavid empires because they're of relevance to the region of the world that this series is about, the Middle East and North Africa. And they're also important as well because of the impacts they would leave on the Middle East region today. So we're going to find that there's a lot of things about these empires that are critical for the present day. So first, to understand these empires and their formation, we have to understand the Turkish invasions of the Middle East. Now, the Turks, they were a group of people that spoke a common set of languages in a region called Central Asia. That's where countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan are today. And these peoples were nomadic herders. So this region's relatively flat. Conditions are relatively dry, not very good for agriculture, but very good for pastoralism. So if you have cattle, sheep, goats, very good for this type of activity. And these people were organized into different tribes and clans, very much like the Arabian Peninsula before the coming of Islam. Now, during the days of the golden age of Islam, during the days of the Abbasid caliphs, this region, Central Asia, had a subordinate position to the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East. In fact, during the days of the Abbasid caliphs, they made a lot of military incursions into Central Asia. They captured a lot of Turks in the wars with these tribal peoples, and many were enslaved. On top of this as well, Islam spread to this region during this era as a result not only of conquest, but of trade and cultural interaction between these Turkish peoples and these Muslim empires to the south. So this is a trend that really began in the 9th century and would build in the following centuries in the aftermath. Now, these Abbasid caliphs, they became increasingly reliant on this era on what we call slave soldiers. Slave soldiers are usually captured from a very young age, so usually young boys. They're forced to convert to Islam, and they are trained as soldiers from when they're young into their adult years. And there are various purposes why the Abbasid caliphs began to use these slave soldiers. Number one, they found that slave soldiers were far more loyal than other Arab tribes within the Middle East, right? So if you capture someone from a young age, you can make them loyal directly to the caliph as opposed to a particular tribe. So they don't have a tribal identity, a slave soldier. They have no other competing forms of identity other than to be loyal to the ruler. So that's one of the reasons why the Abbasid caliphs made use of slave soldiers. Now, there's a variety of other reasons for this as well. Over time, as the caliphs became more authoritarian, as these systems developed into absolute monarchies, they lost touch with the Muslim populations they ruled over. And as it became more authoritarian, the caliphs became increasingly reliant on these slave soldiers to help them rule their empires. They became more loyal than the regular population. So, a couple of big reasons there why the Islamic world became more increasingly reliant on these slave soldiers. And most of them came from Central Asia and the Caucasus regions, and they consisted mostly of these Turkish slaves. Now, in the Arabic language, these slaves were referred to as Mamluk. So, Mamluk means to literally be owned, so someone that is owned. So, a slave soldier becomes known as Mamluks. And the thing with these slave soldiers is they were not normal slaves. Because they became soldiers, many of them rose to the ranks to become powerful officers. They were rewarded by caliphs and later sultans with a lot of wealth, access to land and resources. They themselves would sometimes become slave owners and landowners, and they grew politically powerful as a consequence. And during various points in history, they would sometimes actually overthrow caliphs and sultans and themselves become political leaders. In fact, Egypt was ruled by an oligarchy of Mamluks from 1250 to 1516. So these Mamluks became incredibly powerful in the region. So this is one of the ways that Turks would come to influence the Middle East and North Africa. And so thus, these soldiers trained from a young age, they were seen as more loyal and became an important part of the militaries of the Islamic world in the Middle Age. And if you ever watched Game of Thrones, for example, this is one of the things that inspired George R. R. Martin to have one of those civilizations in that show and in the books, right? Make use of slave soldiers. So that was part of the inspiration for his work. Now, there's also, as well, other important influences of the Middle East on Central Asia during this era. Other than the fact that you had this conquest and the use of slave soldiers, Islam also spread via trade as well into the region. So many Muslim merchants, missionaries, ulama, they went into the region to spread the faith. So Dawah was very active in this region. Many Muslim religious clerics, otherwise known as ulama, set up mosques in Central Asia and spread the faith to these Turkish peoples. Now, as the golden age of Islam came to an end, as the Abbasid Caliphate declined, and I recommend watching my prior video to learn more about this, the Abbasid Caliphate grew weak politically. It had less tax revenue to pay its officers. The empire started to crumble. And what happened was the relationship of power between these Central Asian Turkish tribes and these Muslim empires to the south began to shift. These Turkish tribes became more powerful eventually in relation to the Muslim empires to the south. And this led to a series of invasions by the Turkish tribes in Central Asia. So in the 11th century, one clan known as the Seljuk clan formed this very powerful tribal confederation, and they eventually invaded much of the Middle East. So this was during the decline of the Abbasid Caliphate, and they would eventually conquer the Middle East, and they would intermarry with the Abbasid elites, and they would continue to prop up the Abbasid Caliphate, but real power would fall into the hands of this Seljuk clan, of these Turkish tribes, which would come to dominate the politics of the region for the next couple of centuries. And the Seljuks were just one of many waves of Turks. Other Turkish clans and tribes would follow in the following centuries, as would Mongol invasions as well. So these peoples from Central Asia flooded into the Middle East over the following centuries, not only bringing an end to the golden age of Islam, but seriously decentralizing the politics of the region. So the Middle East breaks up into a great number of different petty empires and small polities over the following centuries. And so just to better understand this, let's take a look at this map here. So you can see where the heartland of the Seljuks was in Central Asia. So this is where Central Asia is located. These peoples migrated south into what is now Iran, into Iraq, then into parts of present-day Turkey, and then finally into much of the rest of the Middle East. And so over time, they became very influential in the politics of the region. So you can see here from 1037 to 1194, is where the major Turkish invasions took place. And this would be followed by Mongol invasions afterwards as well. And so here we can see the Seljuks were very good in terms of organizing a cavalry. That is the warfare on horseback. Because this was a pastoral region, they had a lot of experience riding on horseback. This gave them some advantages on the battlefield. And so over time, these Seljuks invade and create this empire. And so this era in Middle East history was known for political decentralization. The great age of the caliphates come to an end. The Middle East starts to decentralize into a number of different polities. There were dozens of them throughout this time period in history. So the Islamic world essentially loses its unity, right? And this idea of trying to claim oneself as a caliph, as a successor of the Prophet Muhammad, as ruling the entire Islamic community, this now becomes impossible and not realistic. Furthermore, these Turkish rulers could not claim descent from the Arabian Peninsula or the Prophet Muhammad's tribe, the Quraysh, or his clan, the Hashemite. It was impossible to do so. So what happens is we see a change in the politics of the region during this era. The Turks could not claim to have descent from the Arabian Peninsula, nor could they claim to rule the entire Islamic community. And so what starts to decline is the use of this term caliph. We start to see these new Turkish rulers use the Turkish term sultan to describe themselves. Now, what is a sultan? A sultan is a title that means absolute monarch. It's a rule for king, and these sultans did not claim leadership of the entire Islamic world, so it's a more secular term. Their leadership was not based on a religious legitimacy in terms of claiming descent from the Prophet Muhammad, as a lot of Shia did, nor did they claim to rule the entire Islamic community. Instead, their rule was based on their political power, their military prowess, their ability to defeat their enemies on the battlefield and collect taxes and rule the polities they rule over. So, as a consequence, they did not have a secular claim to authority. However, in order to increase their legitimacy with the Muslim peoples they ruled over, they did rely on the help of the ulama. They would give funding to religious scholars and imams and religious judges. These ulama were mainly of Arab descent, so in order to make the Arab populations they ruled over happy, they would continue to give funding to mosques and to religious scholars. And these religious scholars would enforce Sharia law. So Sharia law, that is Islamic law, would continue to be enforced under Turkish rule. But the Turks themselves, the sultans, didn't claim themselves to be caliphs or religious leaders. It's these ulama that would enforce religious laws for them. And so the Turkish sultans were more concerned with conquest and expanding their empires rather than getting involved in the enforcement of Islamic law. Now, to increase their legitimacy, some of these Turkish elites did intermarry with some of these noble Arab families, with, for example, the Abbasid family, with these different clans and tribes that had descent from the Arabian Peninsula. So it's one of the ways they try to increase their political power. So they intermarry with these kind of local families. Many of these Turks as well began to adopt the Arabic language. They learned how to speak it. And they started to turn into more Orthodox Muslims, right? So they learned more about the Islamic faith. And so they eventually became integrated into the cultures of much of the Middle East. That is why most of the Middle East, we don't find the Turkish language spoken. However, there are some languages from the Turkish language that we do find within Arabic today. So the word askari, for example, means military. And we find this within the Arabic world today. Askari itself, it comes from the Turkish language. So these Turks become integrated within the cultures of the Middle East. And we can see here the family tree of the Seljuks. They begin to intermarry with the Abbasid family. So the Abbasids were the caliphs that had ruled over the Middle East for centuries. They intermarry with these people, and they actually continue to prop them up as caliphs while they themselves hold themselves sultans. Okay, so we see this separation of religious from political authority. during this age. Now, what emerged from this is an Islamic world that was decentralized and ruled by a bunch of these different Turkish polities that emerged. One of these Turkish empires that would emerge during this era was the Ottoman Empire, very important for our story. This empire was founded by a Turk named Osman, who grew up in eastern Anatolia. That's where modern Turkey is today. And he would establish a new empire, his clan, called the Ottoman Empire. In fact, the word Ottoman is a derivation of his name Osman. And the beginnings of the empire were in this region called Anatolia, where modern Turkey is currently founded. So we're going to talk more about this in a little bit. Now, over 2 centuries, so from approximately the late 13th century when this empire was founded until the middle of the 15th century, these Turks, the Ottomans, would declare holy war against the Byzantine Empire, that is the Eastern Roman Empire. We talked a little bit about this empire in the last couple of classes. It was a Greek-speaking empire, a Christian empire. It was formed off the remains of the collapsed Roman Empire from the late 5th to the early 6th century. And the Byzantine Empire had been gradually losing political power to Muslims in the previous centuries. And the Ottoman Empire, for 2 centuries, had a holy war, jihad, that they declared on the Byzantine Empire. So over 2 centuries, they fight with Byzantium, and eventually they emerged victorious. So Sultan Murad II, he conquers Constantinople, that is the capital of the Byzantine Empire, in 1453. He did so with the help of gunpowder. I'm going to explain why this is more important in a second. And this very famous Christian city gets renamed Istanbul. So this is another important legacy of the Turks. Constantinople gets a new name, and the main church within Constantinople, Hagia Sophia, which was founded during the height of the Byzantine Empire, it becomes a mosque. It gets converted into a mosque. And so thus, the center of the Greek Byzantine Empire suddenly becomes a symbol of Islam. And this Ottoman Empire would spread in the following centuries. By 1517, the Ottoman Empire conquered Egypt, Syria, and the Arabian Peninsula. And between 1520 and 1566, the Ottomans conquered what is North Africa and the Balkans, creating this massive empire. Now, a couple of important things about this empire. When they conquered Anatolia, when they conquered what is now Turkey and Istanbul, they pushed the Greek populations out of the region. So whereas with the rest of the Middle East, the Muslims came to accept their rule, when it came to their conquest of Byzantium, the Greeks fled. And when they fled, Turks occupied this region, and the Ottoman sultans, they gave lands to their Turkish soldiers, and they settled down in Anatolia. That's why modern Turkey today speaks the Turkish language. Whereas in other parts of the region, the Ottomans would become integrated into Arab culture, and Arabs would continue to speak, Arabic would continue to be the language spoken in the rest of the Middle East. Now, part of what enabled the Ottoman Empire to conquer these regions so quickly was a very important innovation, and that is gunpowder. Gunpowder was something that was invented in China. It came through the Middle East due to the Silk Road. It was initially used actually for fireworks, but eventually the Turks would figure out how to use it for guns, for cannons. And this was incredibly important because during the Middle Ages, the main source of defense for different empires and polities was the castle and the use of walls. Cities were surrounded with walls. Castles were built throughout the empires of Eurasia. But with the invention of gunpowders, you could knock down these walls. And this also enabled this powerful weapon for empires to centralize their control over vast territories. So this explains the spread of the Ottoman Empire. And it's also an important modern development in the development of states, not only in the Middle East, but in Europe and elsewhere. So the Ottoman Empire was important for the innovation of gunpowder, hence why it's known as a gunpowder empire. So these Turks create this massive empire. And it's also a reason as well why they were able to defeat Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople historically had these massive walls that protected the city, but the Turks, they were able to now use gunpowder to knock those walls down. They defeat the Byzantine Empire. And so let's just look at this spatially to understand this more. This was the empire created by the Ottomans. It's this massive empire. It started in this region of Anatolia in eastern Turkey. You can see where cities like Konya are located here. And from there, they spread into the lands of the Byzantine Empire. You can see where Istanbul is located here. They conquered the Byzantine Empire completely, and then they invaded the Balkans. Okay, that's where Greece, Serbia, Albania, Romania, Bulgaria, other countries are located today. And they spread north and they reached the gates of Vienna, where Central Europe is located, where Austria is located today. So they created this massive empire that expanded into parts of Eastern Europe. And they also expanded into the heartlands of the Middle East, conquering Mecca and Medina, conquering Egypt, and then North Africa. So where Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya are located today. So this empire was massive. So from 1300 up until 1566, they created at the time that what was one of the world's most massive empires. And if you had gone back in time, if you took a time machine to the 16th century, you would have thought that Islam was on the way to conquering the entire world. And of course, just like previous empires in Islamic history, great mosques and pieces of architecture, palaces were built. So if you go to Istanbul in Turkey today, you'll find a lot of this amazing Islamic architecture. And you can see here an image of Hagia Sophia, very important mosque today for the Islamic world. Now, a couple of important things about the Turkish language here. You could see here that Turkish is spoken by peoples that are mostly outside of the Middle East today, what is known as Central Asia. So here's Kazakhstan, we have Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan here. So these Central Asian countries are mainly Turkish speaking. But because of the fact that Greeks fled Anatolia during these Turkish invasions, this region of Anatolia here, what is now Turkey, they speak the Turkish language. Whereas the other provinces of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East and North Africa, they continue to speak the Arabic language. So we can see Turkish is not spoken as a main language elsewhere. So when we speak of the Ottomans as being a Turkish empire, it's because the leaders were Turkish, okay, and the heartlands in Anatolia were Turkish. But their other provinces spoke a great variety of different languages and had many different religions. Ottoman governance. So how was this vast empire governed? Well, the Ottoman Empire was led by a sultan, and they did not claim to rule the entire Islamic community during most of this empire's history. And so they were an absolute monarchy with a secular authority. And it was quite a brutal empire at its beginnings. It really emphasized conquests of other regions, and every region they conquered, they would bring back booty, treasury to the center of the empire to enrich their loyal followers. And after the death of each sultan, they had a unique way of succession. They didn't just hand over power to the eldest son, right, or the eldest male relative. Instead, the sons, kind of a Game of Thrones scenario, or perhaps a Hunger Games scenario, all the sons would fight to the death with one another for control over the sultanate. And this was known as fratricide, this little tradition, and it did several ways. Number one, it got most of the potential heirs out of the way, right? So that once one won, all the other competitors, all the other sons would be eliminated. What it also did as well is it kind of ensured that the most ruthless, the most military savvy son would come into power. So this practice of fratricide became very popular. Now, these sultans were not the most educated folk, okay? Many of them had a pastoral background. They were mainly focused on military affairs and conquest. So they were usually out on horseback conquering some part of the empire. And thus, to run the day-to-day affairs of the empire, the boring stuff, they would leave it to what's called a grand vizier, someone who was well educated, usually someone who was educated in the Arab sciences and Arab literature, in Sharia law, someone who knew how to collect taxes, run a bureaucracy. They would leave this to a grand vizier, and much of the bureaucracy was staffed with Arabs. Right, so they relied on many of the peoples of their empire who had experience running an empire to do so. Lots of Greeks as well, some Greek Orthodox Christians as well helped them run this empire. And the Sunni Arab ulama, as I mentioned before with these Turks, just like other Turkish empires, the Ottomans relied on them to enforce Sharia law. And in this particular empire, Sunnism was promoted. There are four major schools of thought within Sunnism: Hanbali, Hanafi, Maliki, and Shafi. All four of them were promoted under this empire. So Sunni Arab Islam becomes the major religion of this empire. And the Ottomans actually organized a hierarchy of religious scholars, the ulama, into a strict hierarchy. And at the top of this hierarchy was the Sheikh el-Islam, who was in charge of managing all of these different judges throughout the empire to interpret Islamic law. And these Arab ulama had an agreement with the Sultan. The Sultan would be given secular earthly authority over this empire, right? He would be in charge of the empire and the military. And in exchange, the ulama would be in charge of religious authority, so interpreting and enforcing religious law throughout the empire. And so the job of the Sultan was to protect these ulama. In exchange, the ulama would give the Sultan legitimacy. They would recognize his rule. And so this went on for several centuries here. So this is an important part of how this system worked. So Islam would continue to be promoted during this empire. Now, another important thing about the Ottomans, so just like other Turkish rulers, is they depended highly on slave soldiers. They had an important slave corps called the Janissary. It was an elite military force. Many of these individuals were actually captured Christians that were forced into enslavement, and they were trained from a very young age. It was an elite military force and became a very important part of the Ottoman military in the following centuries. So just like other slave soldiers, they were trained from a very young age. Furthermore, just like previous Islamic empires, there was partial religious tolerance of monotheists, right? We have the people of the book here that were they were allowed to continue to practice their faith as long as they paid a special tax. They had to pay higher taxes than Muslims. So Christians and Jews were allowed to continue to practice their faith under the Ottoman Empire as long as they respected Islamic authority, as long as they paid a special tax and avoided proselytization. They didn't try to convert Muslims. The Turks knew this as the Malay system, right? So just like previous empires, these religious minorities could continue to exist under Islamic rule. And since the Ottoman Empire conquered a large British empire in the Balkans, this became important to the stability of the empire. So they allowed these different faiths to continue to preach as long as it was within their own communities. All right, so just a couple of images to display some important aspects of this empire. The Ottomans here, they used cannons to destroy the walls of cities across the Middle East and North Africa, centralizing their control over this empire. And so thus, gunpowder was central to these empires, an important step to the development of the modern state and the coming of the modern world. And it's also what allowed these sultans to become these absolute monarchs with a lot of political power. So they put down their rivals throughout the Middle East and North Africa with a lot of brutality and violence. And it's these slave soldiers trained in weapons from a young age, the use of rifles from a young age, this became very important step in military history. Now, a couple of other things about the Ottoman Empire of great importance. So, as I said, religious norms were promoted, Sunni Islam, and traditional religious norms in terms of patriarchy, male dominance, right? All of the sultans were males. All the members of their bureaucracy were men. Women were expected to have a subordinate position, to run the household, to raise the children. And in fact, the wives of the elites were kept behind closed doors in what's known as a harem. And they could marry up to 4 wives. And the sultans themselves would usually not only marry 4 wives, but would have large numbers of concubines, that is, slave women, women who were used for sex. Oftentimes, they had dozens of these concubines within these large palaces kept behind closed doors. And the harem, it was secluded, right? So males from outside of the household could not enter the harem at all. Okay, only the sultan, okay, had the permission to go inside. And protecting the harem from these bodyguards, they were known as eunuchs. And these eunuchs, they had their private parts cut off, right? So they became sexually impotent. What they would often do is they would capture young boys, enslave them, and then they would do these operations where they would cut off their private parts. Many of these young boys died during these operations. Those that survived would become eunuchs guarding these harem. It's not only the sultan that had these harems, but rich elites throughout the empire. If you could afford it, you would have as many domestic servants and concubines as you can afford. And so thus it became a source of pride to have these very large harems, these large palaces to house these women. And so thus there was this gender hierarchy. Now, of course, most Muslims during this era couldn't afford harems. In fact, most couldn't afford more than 1 wife. So most remained monogamous in the villages, in the countryside. Women would be out in public working in the fields, not being secluded behind closed doors. But within the cities, at the centers of power, these harems were very common. Now, just one last thing. This trend of a gunpowder empire led by a sultan was not just found in the Ottoman Empire, but was found elsewhere in the Islamic world. And the other empire I'm going to talk about here was the Safavid Empire. It dominated Iran during this empire. It's an empire that lasted from 1501 to 1732. It was founded by a Turkish Muslim named Ismail I. His clan was a member of a Turkish Sufi order. It was called the Safaviya. And more importantly for our story here, they were also a Twelver Shia movement. So they preached Twelver Shia Islam. If you remember from a previous lecture, this is a version of Twelver Shia, a version of Shia Islam that believes that there were 12 rightful successors to the Prophet Muhammad, and that the last of these successors died and went into hiding and would return at the end of time as a savior of mankind. And so his clan consisted of 12 Shia that sought to preach this faith throughout the Middle East. And in fact, Ismail himself, what was unique about this character is that he claimed to be the Mehdi, the savior of mankind. He claimed to be the 12th Imam that had come out of hiding to save all of humanity and lead the way towards the end of times. Now, of course, what's interesting about this claim is that he's Turkish, right? So he's not from the Arabian Peninsula. So how can he be related to the Prophet Muhammad? He actually forged his genealogy. Most people would not believe his claim, but he did have a small group of loyal followers called the Kizilbash. This was a military group that supported his claim to be the Mehdi. And they would end up going on to conquering southern Iraq, Iran, and western Afghanistan from 1501 to 1524. So over a period of about 20 years, this small little group of radicals would create the Safavid Empire. And the name of Safavid comes from the name of the Safaviya, the name of this Sufi order that emerged in the 16th century. So this Turkish clan goes on to conquer this large empire with its base in Iran. And it would reach its height under the rule of Abbas I from 1588 to 1629. And just like the Ottoman Empire, had several things in common with the Ottoman Empire. It made use of gunpowder and slave soldiers to create this massive empire. And in the process itself, it defeated its enemies and it created this absolute monarchy. And so, thus, we can, just like the Ottoman Empire, call it a gunpowder empire. It is this period where we see the end of the decentralization of the Middle East and the emergence of these very large empires throughout the region. And so here we could see a map of these gunpowder empires. You know, if you went back to the 17th century and you looked at this map, you would have thought that the Islamic world was primed to dominate the rest of the globe, right? So very large empires. And there are also other large empires in Morocco and elsewhere throughout this region of the world. So, the Gunpowder Empire's important movement in world history. Just like the Ottoman Empire, great works of monumental architecture were built. The capital of the Safavid Empire was Isfahan, and their glorious monumental architecture was built. And Safavid governance was also very similar to the Ottoman government. Now, they didn't call their ruler a sultan. Instead, they used this term Shah, which is just another word for monarchy. And it's the Persian word for king. And in fact, these Safavid Turkish rulers, when they conquered Iran, they would become assimilated into Persian culture. They would learn the Farsi language. So just like many of the Turkish rulers would become assimilated into Arab culture, these Safavid rulers would become assimilated into Persian culture. So they would adopt the Farsi language. This would become the language of the administration. And just like the Ottomans, they made great use of slave soldiers and they used a vizier to run the empire. So while the Shahs were focused on conquest, they had this bureaucracy run by these Persian noble families that would continue to collect taxes for the king. And the Shahs, just like the Ottoman Empire, would rely on the religious scholars. But instead of relying on Sunni ulama, the Shahs relied on Shia ulama. They would go and preach and spread the Shia faith to the rest of the Safavid Empire. Now, what's an important point to note here is that while Ismail claimed to be the Mahdi, his successors did not. Most people didn't believe this claim, and they went back to the standard Orthodox Twelver Shia beliefs that the Mahdi had yet to return. So when Abbas the first, he dropped this idea that he was the Mahdi, that he was the savior of mankind. And he did not make this claim to being descended from the Prophet Muhammad. So they gave up on this claim, and instead they went back to Orthodox Twelver Shia beliefs. And so Twelver Shiism, it becomes the religion of the state as a consequence. And just like with the Ottoman Empire being Sunni Muslim, here we see the Safavid realm promoting Twelver Shiism. And over the course of several centuries, because the Shahs gave funding to Twelver Shia ulama, they built mosques for them, they set up madrasas, that is schools. Most people in Iran over the following centuries converted to Twelver Shiism. Now, if you want to get a little bit of a review on the differences between Sunni and Shia Muslims, I recommend checking out my previous lecture on this topic. And in the process of this, the Safavid Empire fought in several wars with the Ottoman Empire, not only over political power and land, but to spread their two versions of Islam. So the Safavids, they become the Shia Empire, the Ottomans become a Sunni empire. And so religion was also another cause of these wars. And in fact, this conflict, it crystallized the modern Sunni-Shia divide in Islam. In the regions where we find Sunnism dominate, it's in the lands that the Ottoman Empire conquered. Whereas in the lands where we find Shiism dominate, it's mainly in the lands where the Safavids conquered as a consequence of this. And so here's a map of the Safavid Empire. You can see their heartland was in Iran here. They also at various points controlled southern Iraq, which today, by the way, is majority Shia, and as well as parts of Western Afghanistan, which is also majority Shia today. And so we could see here the modern Sunni Shia divide. The Ottomans, so they control the western parts of the Middle East. Today, the vast majority of the people there are Sunni Muslims. And then Iran, they control the eastern part of the Middle East, the vast majority being Shia Muslims. So this is a something that really got left behind by these empires, this influence, along with the emergence of these kind of absolutist states, the emergence of gunpowder. We see here the emergence of this kind of crystallized Sunni Shia divide throughout the region. Okay, so that does it for my lecture. For the next lecture, we're going to discuss how these empires are going to decline and collapse, and it has to do with the emergence of modernity in Europe. So for those who watch my next lecture, I will see you next time. And please leave a comment down below if you have any questions about this era of Islamic history.